Welcome to the Forum by the Harvard School of Public Health. We're here to talk about global health and come up with a plan for the future, a new vision of global health in the future. My name is Abigail Trafford, and I'm an author and former health editor at the Washington Post, and I'm your moderator. I want to introduce our panelists first. Mark Dybul, who is Executive Director of the Global Fund to Fight AIDS, Tuberculosis, and Malaria. And next to him is Julio Frank, whom we know, who is Dean of Harvard School of the Public Health. And across the pond from Scotland is the Right Honorable Gordon Brown, MP, who is United Nations Special Envoy for Education. Today's program is a collaboration between the Forum and Global Post. It's a live webcasting series, and it's produced at the Harvard School of Public Health. And very fittingly, we are celebrating our 100th anniversary this year. It's you can tweet us at Forum HSPH and at Global Post. You can also send an email to theforum, one word, hsph.harvard.edu. For the next hour, we're going to explore all the issues, and we're going to come up with a blueprint for action. We're going to take questions from both all of you in the audience and also online. So I'm going to jump right into it, and I'm going to turn to you, Mark, really for a historical view. You know, we've made a great deal of success in global health. I mean, I look at your organization. Look what we've done for AIDS and tuberculosis and malaria. But you know, we're disappointed and frustrated, haven't met our Millennium Goals. A lot of people are totally left out. You can cure malaria, but then someone dies in childbirth. What went wrong?
Well, we should start with what went right, because it's pretty remarkable where we are compared to 12 years ago. If you just look at when the Millennium Development Goals were introduced, tremendous progress on HIV, TB, and malaria, tremendous progress on education, tremendous progress on poverty. But, you know, to look for the future and where we can improve, I wouldn't say where we went wrong, I'd say where we can evolve to, because this is all an evolutionary phase, and things will continue to improve, is how we got to where we are today. And the reality is that the birth of development isn't the most palatable thing. It was colonialism. Where development started in Africa, Asia, Latin America was really out of colonialism. People wanted their workers to be just a little healthy, or their slaves. They wanted to be just a little educated. They needed roads to get the gold and silver moved around, and that's where development started. And then we went through different phases. You know, after World War I, a lot of people don't know that Herbert Hoover, he's remembered for the destruction of the world's economy. But he actually created the first large, massive food program to feed Europe after World War I. And then after World War II, of course, the Marshall Plan helped rebuild in a development way. But we also had the Cold War. And so we moved from a colonialistic and missionary, you know, there were missionaries involved at the beginning too, with some very good things, some humanitarian things, but some pretty bad things about people being treated in different ways or seen as less than human. So after that, we moved into basically a Cold War approach, where it wasn't so important what happened with money. You were basically trying to buy spheres of influence. And so that wasn't the best origin for where we wanted to get to. And the reality is institutions that are created during times are created with a culture and a structure that reflects the time. And that needed to all change. You know, realistically, if you asked anyone 12 years ago what was happening in education, health, any issue of health, food, the answer would have been we're spending X millions of dollars. It wouldn't have been we're trying to achieve this or that. It would have been we're spending X amount of money. And the reality is if you're trying to win influence, you don't really care what happens with your money. And if you're living in post-colonial guilt, you don't really care about what happens with your money because all you're trying to do is make yourself feel better. So you're not really looking for outcomes. You're trying to make yourself feel better, or you're trying to make people feel better about you by buying them off, basically. So then something historic happened in the year 2002, if I remember, no, three, the Monterey Consensus, which Julio was down in Mexico during that. And that actually looked backwards and said, you know, we made a lot of progress, a lot of things have happened, but what do we need to do to change? And there really, it was a revolutionary, historic genetic shift. In the past, really, we just kind of moved along. Institutions got created. They responded to emergencies. But people stopped and said, what do we really need to do? And what came out of that, it's very short. It's only a couple pages, actually, the Monterey Consensus. And what it said was there are 5 major principles. One is shared responsibility and mutual accountability. So we needed to move past the paternalism of colonialism and post-colonial guilt, where we're the saviors coming in to do things for people, to a real partnership, a shared responsibility, a mutual accountability, where everyone needs to be involved and people need to be held responsible, both those who provide resources and those who use the resources. And we need to see each other as partners in a two-way relationship, not a one-way relationship. And that's called country ownership, which is a pretty unattractive word for really shared responsibility and mutual accountability. The second was, if you're going to achieve that, you need to have a results-based approach, not a money-based approach. Not how much money do you spend, but what results are you going to get. The third is good governance. And people immediately jump to corruption, but that's not what good governance is. Good governance is using the money well to get results. And part of that is don't steal the money, but part of it is use the money well. It's true in this country, it's true in the United Kingdom, as true as it is in other places. And the last is really fundamentally important, which is all sectors need to be involved. So in the past, it was always public to public sector to public sector, government to government. And one of the great insights of the Monterey Consensus, it's really people to people. All sectors, the private sector, non-governmental sector, academic sector, everyone needs to be involved if we're going to have development. The final piece was economic growth is going to fuel true development. What we're doing in the midterm is some other things. So if you take that, and of course I'm kind of sweeping over 200 years with big assumptions, but that's generally the arc that we've seen. The opportunity now is to take those fundamental principles, which led to things like the Global Fund. We were structured based on that culture. We weren't 21st century culture. We weren't based on the assumptions and culture of the past when many of the other organizations were created. And that gives you a lot more flexibility, a lot more opportunity. The Global Alliance for Vaccines and Immunizations was created in that way. And so the real opportunity is to have 21st century institutions to implement 21st century ideals and ideas rather than trying to cram 21st century ideas into 20th or even 19th century institutions. And that's really hard because culture and structure is really tough to overcome and change. So we have this remarkable opportunity to look at things in a new way, an exciting way that began with the Monterey Consensus, moved forward, and we're really fortunate to be with 2 leaders. You know, Julio did most of this in Mexico. He actually implemented it all, and Gordon, as Prime Minister, was one of the few leaders in the world that really got this and has been pushing this forward. So it's a real privilege to be with the 2 of them because we wouldn't be doing or having this conversation without the work they've done.
What about the practice of siloing? That we seem to have programs aimed at specific diseases, which is not doesn't bring in all the other aspects of health. What about that practice, and what have been some of the consequences?
Well, again, if we go back to 12 years ago, look where we were. Everyone was just looking at how much money you spent, not results you got. And from a taxpayer perspective, or people like Gordon Brown who had to decide what you do with taxpayer money, if you don't have any results, how are you going to convince people you ought to spend money on it? I mean, that all started to unravel. And literally, you would see examples of a development agency committing $50,000 in a country and saying that they could take credit for everything that was happening in that country. That was nuts. So there had to be a moment at which there was a massive investment in something that showed results. And that's how the Global Fund was created. That's how the U.S. President's Emergency Plan for AIDS Relief was created, the President's Malaria Initiative, the Millennium Challenge Corporation. These were institutions that were created to move and respond to a new approach to development, including results. So we had to show that you could invest billions of dollars. And PEPFAR is a great example. I mean, $15 billion that was President Bush thought of and created. The Congress in a bipartisan way adopted, and it's been bipartisan from the beginning. President Obama has carried it forward in a very exciting way with great leadership. So it's very bipartisan, but we had to show that a massive investment of billions of dollars would lead to results. And that would be hard to do if you're doing everything. Now we can look differently. You have to take steps. It's evolution. It's not that was bad, this is good. It's what happened and why and where are we going. Now we can look at the health of people. and say, how are we going to keep a person healthy? So if you save someone's life from HIV, a mother's life from HIV by treating her, but she dies in childbirth, the child's no better off, she's no better off, the family's no better off, the community's no better off. So how do we look at health more holistically? And again, I think that's something that these two gentlemen have thought about and done a lot on. And then I think Gordon will talk about, and what about a step further?
Yeah, let me now turn to you, Gordon Brown. We all know the triangle, the critical triangle of health, education, and development. But tell us a little bit about your work in the education field.
Well, let me first of all congratulate Harvard School of Public Health on celebrating its centenary, a great achievement. We have many ancient institutions here in Britain, and we sometimes say that the first 100 years of any institution's history are always the most difficult. So we wish Harvard well for the future. I'm also privileged to be on a platform, so to speak, even though it's virtual, with Mark and Julio. These guys have done an enormous amount, and their writing is, I think, the most stimulating, the most far-reaching in its implications of any writing that is done on health at the moment. So it's a great privilege to be with them. I'm very surprised you've chosen a politician to add to the two experts. The last time I spoke to a forum, someone quoted the definition of a politician as being someone who's lost the art of communication, but not, alas, the gift of speech. So I will continue to give my views, but I do understand that I'm talking with two great experts. Look, it's been a golden age for health in the sense that Mark has described it. Huge additional resources, more so than, for example, education, which I'll come on to. Great institutional advances, great philanthropic activity as well with Bill Gates and of course the creation of the Global Fund, which Mark now runs. So this has been an innovative decade, and we've reduced infant mortality very substantially, and there have been major advances in the treatment of the terrible life-threatening diseases, polio, AIDS, tuberculosis, major advances made. But what do we learn at the end of this decade, particularly in a context where there is more questioning about the use of resources? I think the first thing we learn is that we have to think of the individual as a whole. That too many of the initiatives were disease-specific. Too little was done to build the capacity of healthcare systems. And so while anybody who's in the medical field knows that you're dealing with chronic and acute diseases, not enough attention perhaps was on the everyday work of building healthcare systems, of training nurses, training doctors, training health workers generally. That leads to two conclusions on my part. One is that we've got to think of education and health together, and Mark really prefixed these remarks that I was going to make. If you take girls' education, if you educate a girl, as I think Mark was implying, then that is almost the best chance you have of avoiding early pregnancies, of avoiding all the difficulties associated with them, of avoiding the contraction of HIV, of avoiding a whole series of other problems that arise in ill health. And the failure to advance girls' education for millions of children has been a major problem that I think is causing difficulties in every field, employment, but also in health. And if we look at the statistics in sub-Saharan Africa, the chances of an uneducated girl dying in childbirth are twice as high as the chances of an educated girl surviving childbirth. So these are important statistics that I think we've got to be borne in mind. And we need programs, and I've talked to Mark about this, that look at education and health together and look at the importance of education for all being perhaps one of the best ways that we can achieve health for all. I think the second aspect of this is what I've mentioned, and that is that we have disease-specific programs and we haven't looked at capacity as a whole. I met the president of Sierra Leone a few months ago. They have only 100 doctors for a country, I think, of more than 7 million people, 100 doctors trained every year. They have 100 nurses and about the same number of midwives. Many of them are lost to the system because they can get better salaries going abroad. But the shortage of capacity in healthcare systems in the countries that are most vulnerable is something we've got to deal with. Can I briefly say what the other points I think we should talk about? One is innovative financing, huge advances made in health about the use of resources. And Mark mentioned people are not any longer interested in just in the inputs, it is about the outputs. We need to look again at how we can use resources better. I think some of the new proposals that are coming, for example, the Health Impact Fund, I think it's Professor Porgi has put this forward, these are worth looking at. And I know myself that the way we use resources has got to be rethought. And Helio and Mark have suggested that if we could coordinate the use of resources more effectively at a global level, then perhaps we could get 4 or 5 times greater value from the money we're actually spending at the moment. And that raises my final point for the start of this. The weakness of international cooperation. While there has been huge advances, I think we can genuinely conclude that there has been a stalling in the last few years in international cooperation on the big issues. It's true of the economy, it's true of finance, it's true of the coordination of the effort on the environment, where the climate change talks failed, obviously, but it is also true on health and education, and in particular, if I look at health, why are we not more effective in bringing together the health professionals, the governments, the international organizations, and the private sector, and the voluntary organizations and foundations that are involved in health? Perhaps we need to give the Global Fund more powers and more scope to go further. Perhaps we need better relationships between the WHO and the other institutions that exist. Perhaps national governments have got to combine their efforts more effectively instead of focusing too much on bilateral aid. But what I feel we need to talk about today is how we can more effectively coordinate the use of resources by greater cooperation between all those people who are in the global health field. And if we were to do that, then I'm absolutely sure that with the same amount of resources, hopefully more, but even with the same amount of resources, we could achieve 4 or 5 times as much in the global health field.
Thank you. And I'm going to turn to you, Julio. This is a good segue. You talk about a diagonal system. What is that? And give us some examples of that.
Sure. Well, first of all, let me say that in the context of our centennial, it is truly an honor to welcome here to the forum Gordon Brown and Mark Dybul. We're really delighted that you could participate in this special centennial forum to look at the future of global health. I think both Mark and Gordon have clearly outlined the challenge we have. There is a tension between the focus on results, which calls for very specific targets, and I do think the MDGs were an incredible step forward in terms of getting every country in the world to agree on a set of common goals and targets, and to have a system of regular reporting. I mean, this is unprecedented in the history of international relations, to have every country in the world hold itself accountable to its own people and to the rest of the global community for a common set of limited, specific, and time-bound goals. So I think, whatever we discuss about the content of the MDGs, it's the fact that it created this unprecedented mechanism for mutual accountability that I think is its greatest value. Now, there was that pressure to focus on specific, in the case of health, specific diseases. And where we run into the limit of that is, first of all, the fact that people do get sick of multiple things, but especially that those disease-specific targets do not take into account the consequences of success, the dynamic of health, which is such that we are always victims of our own success. So we've had this ongoing debate between so-called vertical approaches that focus on specific diseases with the advantages that it's highly measurable and results-oriented, versus the horizontal school of thought, which says, no, what we need to do is strengthen health systems, strengthen the delivery platforms generically, and they will figure out what to deal with without a clear sense of priorities. The problem with the horizontal approach is that every time you just strengthen health systems without a clear sense of priorities, typically those health systems end up catering to the needs of the better off or the powerful. So my colleague Jaime Sepúlveda extended that geometric analogy and say, well, it's not vertical, this is specific, it's not horizontal, strengthening without priorities, it's a diagonal approach. The diagonal approach, what it means, is that you do use specific priorities to drive improvements that then build the capacity to deal with other issues, including with the consequences of success. Because, if we're successful in reducing maternal mortality, the same women who would have died in childbirth are exactly the same women that will now live long enough to develop cervical cancer or breast cancer. And by a diagonal approach, you don't have the work done by dealing only with the specific target. You use those clear priorities to drive improvements that are there to face the next set of priorities. The other sense of the diagonal is what Gordon Brown was alluding to. The understanding that health is not a silo or a specific sector of public action, whether public responsibility, whether it's locally or globally, but that health must be thought of as an objective, a social objective, for the pursuit of which we have to mobilize all the tools of public policy. He just gave the example. Education is a fundamental investment to improve health. If we think of health not as the objective of the health system, but as a social objective that's broadly shared. And I think that's the other way of thinking diagonally, which is across sectors, and to think in the global level of not just global health governance, but global governance for health. How do we talk about health as an objective and not as a sector?
Is there any examples of a programs or a country that is far along in this more holistic diagonal approach?
Well, there's many examples. Obviously, the example I know best is my own country, where we explicitly used, when we realized there were half of the population, 50 million people who were uninsured, and we needed to get legislation to have a vast expansion of public investment in health so that we could now cover 50 million uninsured people. It was very important to convey a clear sense of deliverables. And we explicitly used a diagonal approach where there were a number of priorities. For example, reducing maternal mortality was a top priority. And that approach drove the general improvements in the delivery platforms. You needed to have places for women to go to deliver. You needed to have blood supply for obstetric emergencies. You need to have outreach community workers to detect. And I think the Global Fund and the work that Mark has done is a great example of how the work with AIDS, or PEPFAR, your previous legacy of using those platforms, in this case around AIDS, to then use them for expanding other sets of interventions as we become successful in the initial targets.
Mark, some thoughts?
Well, to build on what Julio said, if your goal is to build a health system, that's what you're going to do. And what will the indicators be? How many doctors do you have? How many nurses do you have? How many hospitals do you have? That's not the goal of health or a health system. The goal of health is healthier people. So if your goal is building a health system, you can have a great health system and have minimal impact on health. So if you start with a goal, as Julio said, of healthy people, you then start building what's necessary for healthy people, and you start linking health to other sectors like education. I mean, there is this wonderful moment in the post-millennium development goals to really look at women and girls. And what do women and girls need? Well, they need education and they need health. And then what does that impact? Well, it impacts economic growth, and we actually have pretty good data on that. And it actually may have a pretty big impact on democracy, because women are actually much nicer and work together much better than men do. And so, we start to look at how do we create the societies we want, the global environment that we want, and then how do pieces fit into it, rather than starting from either the lowest common denominator of a health system, or starting with a specific goal that is dissected from everything else, and start looking at things in a more holistic way. Now, that's easy to say. You then actually have to invest in a way that leads to those outcomes. But it's all about goal setting. What do you want? And then you can figure out how to do it. And that's really been the problem for the last 100 years, and that's why, if you're looking forward, it's always good to look backwards and see where you came from. And in the past, we really have just built stuff individually when a need arose. We created a new institution for children. We created a new institution for family planning. We created Well, that's not a very healthy way to do it. Now, you also can't have a grand architect sitting around putting all the pieces together, because the world's more complicated than that. But I do think that we're in a new place, and you cannot underestimate the leadership of the political leadership of the last 10 years from people like Gordon and the political leaders during that time, Tony Blair, George Bush. Now we have David Cameron committing to 0.7% for the United Kingdom, which is pretty remarkable. You have President Hollande, despite the difficult times, maintaining their commitments. That political leadership of the last 10 years is what we need. We talk about health and education as if we can all do it. We actually can't. It takes remarkable political leadership. If it's not a political priority, none of this is going to happen. So to make all this happen, we need leaders and people like Gordon to be taking this forward. Otherwise, we're going to get stuck in our own little world.
Gordon, you are working on vision for 2025. Give us some of your thoughts, picking up on what Mark said.
The thing that I would want to introduce into this discussion is a consideration of issues of inequality. And I think we must not miss this when we're looking at the next set of Millennium Development Goals. Because the danger has been over these last few years that while we are committed to universal targets, that we miss out on the bottom 10% or the bottom 5% or the bottom 15%. Certainly it's true, education is true also in many areas of health. And you end up with a situation where we're always rightly trying to raise the ceiling. So we're trying to build for the future with quality targets for doing better in every area. But we have not yet built the floor. And I think there has got to be some consideration as we finish this process of the first set of Millennium Development Goals about those who've missed out, those who've been left out, those who are left behind almost entirely. And as Yulia was suggesting, they're almost usually the same people in health as they are in education. So the illiterate is the person most vulnerable to disease, is the person who's least likely to have a job, is the person who's most likely to die early, and is the person whose children are most likely to be susceptible to themselves having diseases and conditions. So I do think there is a danger, and I just want to inject this into this conversation as we look to the future of setting Millennium Development Goals that are rightly more ambitious about the future and rightly demand higher ceilings, but because our targets are sort of almost built on averages, we need to make sure that we don't miss out on a generation of people. And if you take the case of girls, for example, 32 million girls not at school, 500 million girls who will never complete their education under the current circumstances, and of course still very high levels of maternal mortality amongst young teenage girls, still high levels of infant mortality as a result of their failure to be in a position to take care of the children or to be healthy when their child is born. So let's not forget the goals of dealing with some of these great inequities. And I think a great deal more thinking has got to be done as to whether you look at income inequalities or simply at health inequalities and education inequalities, which we tend to do. As far as thinking forward to 2025, I mean, I'm obviously fascinated by the advance of technology and what it can do, but I'm also fascinated by the ability to do such more with technology and yet the inequality of access to it. So again, there is a question of equity that has got to be addressed when we're looking at the future of both healthcare and generally the Millennium Development Goals. We have within our grasp far greater technological advance than we've ever seen before. In fact, those people who say that technological advance is ground to a halt will be proved completely wrong, because I see even greater speed of technological advance benefiting healthcare in the years to come. But again, I just raise this issue that I think we've got to address, that the access to this new technology is unequal. So 25% of the diseases of the world, the conditions of bad health in the world are in Africa. Only 3% of the money that is spent in the world on health is spent in Africa, and only 1% of the health employees of the world are in Africa. And that is a figure or a set of figures that I think sums up this challenge, that we need to have equity at the center of our considerations, as well as the general issues that are so important that have just been addressed, of getting the right results, using the money effectively, and having very clear goals in other areas as well.
Thank you. I think here's a moment we're going to turn it over to you, the audience, and take some questions. I just want to point out also that the forum had a special forum on girls in education several months ago. So, questions from the audience? Yes. Please state your name and then your question.
Good morning. I'm John McDonough. I'm with the Department of Health Policy and Management. I'd like to ask you if you could expand on your reference to the private sector and their role in this. On the one hand, we see global corporations as the source of tobacco and tobacco-related disease and poor diets and leading to chronic disease. On the other hand, we see global corporations embracing new forms of corporate social responsibility. We see them embracing population health improvement as part of their missions. And I'm wondering if you have any ideas about the appropriate and valuable role that the corporate sector can play and how they should be involved in achieving these goals.
Why don't you go, Mark?
So, part of the Monterey Consensus view was that private sector was one of the key players that needed to engage, and that in the end, economic growth was going to drive real health and development. And if you look at where we are today compared to then, that was anathema before the Monterey Consensus. There's still massive battles being fought on that. Should the private sector be involved? Is there conflict of interest? The reality is that health, education, development are essential for private sector growth. And that's begun to be recognized by the sector. So there's a huge shift in corporate social responsibility away from, we'll create a little foundation over here, and we'll send some money over there, and we'll give little grants, to we need healthy, educated people in the environments we work in, or we're not going to survive, both for productivity, but also for marketplace. You have to have healthy, educated, growing economies in order to have healthy people. So the private sector plays a role in many ways. One is by providing those services directly to their employees or in the community. One is financially. We have the Global Fund is actually a public-private partnership, and we have significant contributions to the Global Fund from the private sector through something called Product Red, through groups like Chevron. But a very important piece is the core competencies of the private sector. A great example of, instead of looking at big picture, starting to look more refined, one of the things you need for a functioning health system is supply chains. And supply chains are actually very complicated in a lot of parts of the world. So we're working with Coca-Cola to help build supply chains, to support governments and countries to build a supply chain. Who better than Coca-Cola to work on a supply chain? So we need that core competency. And one of the biggest challenges in health, education, and everything is management. Financial management, human resource management. Public sector institutions, including universities, are not particularly good at this stuff. The private sector lives or dies on it. And so we're trying to build partnerships that draw core competencies and all of us working together. And it's really got to be driven from the local environment too. I mean, we tend to think about multilateralism and going after them. It's the companies in the countries that for whom this is key and who really engage. And so we are focusing more and more on the private sector in country because that's where the health, education, and development of people really matter.
I think now we want to turn this part of the forum to, how do we implement this grand new vision? And I guess I have to throw out, again to you, Mark, who's going to be the leadership? What happens to the World Health Organization? What could and should the World Health Organization do?
Well, it's an interesting way to start. It's a little bit like saying, what's the big picture, and then going straight to a goal. So I'd rather put the World Health Organization in a bigger context, which is how do we get to, we call it global health architecture, which is pretty boring. We're great about taking big vision ideas and putting words on. What is global health architecture? It's meaningless. It's how you put things together. It's basically how you would fit a bunch of things together in a way that makes more sense. Architecture, building something. And what it really takes is political leadership. So let's just take the Global Fund as an example. When the Global Fund was created, every agency in the world, bilateral and UN, didn't want it to exist because it was a threat. It was a competition. And it was the leadership of Kofi Annan and President Obasanjo from Nigeria that basically just rolled over all the hurdles And you need that political push. No minister of health, no NGO, no private Bill Gates, no one's going to be able to do that. You need the political leadership, and that's why I have repeatedly mentioned the political leadership that was necessary. But we're shifting. The political leadership for the last 10 years has largely come from the G8, from high-income countries. Looking forward, we need that leadership to be coming from a much broader sector. We're talking a lot about the G20 emerging powers and their unique role in the world today. You know, they were, in the old paternalistic jargon, recipients in the old donor-recipient relationship, which is terrible jargon. One thing we have to do is get past the terrible language of development, just those words. If you're living in Africa or Mexico or Turkey, how would you like to be said that you're a recipient, or you're being helped, or you're being aided? It's a partnership. It's not a donor-recipient, it's a partnership. So we've got to get past the language. But we need the engagement of the countries that have emerged from low-income country status, from poor health, from poor development, to actually being able to provide. That's where the leadership really needs to shift to in a broader sense. And so what we've called for is bringing the political leaders from across countries at different income levels to say, what do we need to look like? And we're saying it should be like the Bretton Woods conference. We don't want, this is not an economics thing like Bretton Woods was, and it gets people kind of messed up. But if you think about where we were when Bretton Woods came to be, the world was a mess. You know, the economic architecture, the structures, the institutions had failed. And they weren't fit for purpose to get us from where we were to where we need to be. And that's what we're saying, that we're not fit for purpose right now. We have too many organizations spread all over the place that have multiple, each institution with multiple functions. We fall all over ourselves. The countries have to deal with, 30, 40 institutions in health. Multiply that by all the different parts of development. It's an absolute mess. And the real risk is they're going to start creating themselves like we are in all these different silos to respond to that, rather than creating what they want, which is a comprehensive approach that looks at advancing the health and development of their people. So what we're saying is we should have something like Bretton Woods, that type of big think where people come together and say, what do we need? What do we actually need if our goal is a healthier, more prosperous world where people can be happy and fulfill their full potential? Across the development spectrum, including health. And that, to me, or to us, is what we put forward as a way forward. But it can't be what it was before. It can't be just the G8. It can't be just the high-income countries. It has to be everyone coming together to see how we put things together. Now, the World Health Organization is an essential piece of that. One of the things we all think is necessary is a normative, standard-setting, accountability organization. And that's what the World Health Organization was set up to do. They were not set up to do implementation. They were not set up to do procurement. They were not set up to do program. And they also provide technical support. So a general framework would be to have people who finance health, which is what the Global Fund does. We're a financial institution. A group that provides technical support, whether it's current bilaterals in the UN family, whether it's South to South, what we call South to South partnership on technical issues. But you need some financing groups, you need technical support groups, you need normative groups, something that's going to set standards, and you need someone who's going to do the advocacy and push around and the accountability. So if that's what we need, then why don't we set about creating that and fixing where we are today? But that's going to require a lot of work and a lot of broken china. But we can do it now. We have the opportunity to do it. And I think the reason we have the opportunity is because of the emerging powers. And because the countries have had it with what we've given them, basically. They're not going to put up with what we created anymore. And they're increasing their own economic growth. They're increasing their own contributions. This year, low and middle income countries are providing more money for HIV/AIDS than the so-called donors. Over time, that's going to grow. And the proportion of health and development being provided by the countries themselves will far exceed what is being provided externally. So if we don't get our act together soon, we're not going to be necessary. But we can add a lot as a global community. So I think if we look at the world differently, if we see where we came from and where we need to get to, if we all sit down and say, how would we actually put this together, we can do it in a way that would be exciting, contribute to this broader vision, and really be a genetic jump, which is what the Monterey Consensus was, which is what happened over the last 10 years has been. But the next genetic jump is to say, we've gotten as far as we can the way we're doing it. Let's stop and see where we need to get to. And again, we cannot get to where we need to go in the current environment. We cannot continue to cram these 21st century ideas through 20th and 19th century institutions. It won't work. So the challenge to us is, are we going to pick this up or are we going to just become irrelevant?
Now, Gordon, how do we make this genetic jump? How do we get from, yeah.
Mark is absolutely right. When we created the G20 in 2008 and 9 to deal with the financial crisis, it demanded a few people who were determined to push things forward. And I would just add to what Mark says, I think you do need to involve the private sector and the foundations, as well as governments of emerging markets, the developing world, and the advanced economies. And I think it's bringing them all together, private and public, that is going to be the key to the future. I've just actually come back from China, where I was meeting the president and the premier. And one of the things I was pressing on them is that it was for China now to contribute to education. It's one of the few countries, actually, that I got to before Mark got to them to ask for money for health. So I was quite fortunate. So China has got to be involved. Korea is now far more involved. The other BRIC countries, Brazil and of course Russia, which has not done as much as it should have been doing in recent years, and then some of the other emerging countries, Mexico, Turkey, Indonesia, India, they should be ready to do more. So Mark is absolutely right on that. The other thing that I think comes out of this coordinated process is we have got to continue to look at better ways of innovating in finance. And I mentioned this earlier, but I use the example of Gavi on vaccination and the IFIM facility that we were able to create a few years ago. And we managed, by bringing the public and private sector together, by getting one or two governments, but not many, but one or two governments to support it, to raise 4 billion extra for vaccination from the private sector, which is money, of course, that is being paid back over a 20-year period through the willingness of governments to fund these projects over a continuing budget period. So there are many ways, I think, if you can bring governments, the private sector, the financial sector together, we could do more quickly. And I think it's right that what we need is one or two leaders. Look, if I was in power at the moment, I would be calling such a meeting. Ban Ki-moon could call such a meeting as the Secretary General of the United Nations and maybe encouraged to do so. But there are one or two countries that Mark and Julio know are leading on health who are in a position at the moment to take this initiative and move things forward. But bring in the private sector, bring in the foundations. Of course, the foundations are incredibly important to health, as well as the governments and the international institutions, and look at this holistically again so that we can have a more effective coordination of private and public resources. And to conclude, the last question was about the private sector contribution. I'm impressed by the amount of companies that are wanting to be involved in global health, and we should maximise that involvement by bringing them to the table in a positive and coordinated way.
Julio, why don't you speak to this?
Sure. I mean, one of the side effects of this golden era of global health was that with the expansion of funding, bear in mind, international financing for health went from 5 billion in 1990 to close to 30 billion by 2012. It's an era of enormous growth. Well, the expression of that was an expanded pluralism. And from the days when we had WHO and UNICEF and maybe a few of the multilateral development banks like the World Bank, today there are 175 entities, public, private, voluntary, that are active in global health. Some of them have been hugely innovative in terms of governance, like the Global Fund to fight AIDS, TB, and malaria, like the Global Alliance for Vaccines and Immunizations, but we now have a very pluralistic, what I would call a global health system. And I think what we need to do is think of a global health system, not just the sum of national health systems, but there is a global reality of actors that are interacting in very complex ways, and that are not just the health specialized entities, but all the entities that have an influence on health. Now, the way I think we need to move forward is to think exactly around functions, and that's the way I try to think in general about health systems, whether it's national health systems or global health system, or the global health system. And to my mind, there are 4 functions that need to be performed. And I think Mark was already hinting to that functional view rather than the structural bureaucratic view. But there are 4 key functions. The first is the production of global public goods, knowledge-related global public goods, like research, like comparative analysis, like standards such as the International Classification of Disease. It is paradoxical that in this era of huge expansion of funding, some of those functions are being starved. And if we didn't have the International Classification of Disease, nothing else that we do would happen. And yet there's no movement for the International Classification. These are public goods that are being underfunded even when we have this expansion of funding for specific programs. That first function, I think, is crucial. The second is the management of externalities among countries. And that involves surveillance and coordination because, every time there's an outbreak in one country, it affects other countries. And that needs to be managed at the global level. It's an example of interdependence that needs to be managed and that no country, no matter how powerful, can deal with alone. The third function is the mobilization of global solidarity. And that in turn includes international aid financing, technical cooperation. It also includes serving as an agency for the dispossessed, for people in countries whose governments are the violators of their human rights. That's been the function we've tended to emphasize, and correctly so. But it is only one of 4. And the fourth is stewardship. And that involves and includes coordination, this convening power for something like a Bretton Woods conference, but it also includes the intersectoral advocacy. How do we make sure that the agencies that are dealing with education or with intellectual property or with trade rules see health as an objective? And to me, we need to reconfigure the global system on the basis of the functions, because what we now have is overlap and multiplicity and some of the functions, particularly in international cooperation, and a neglect of other functions, particularly the production of global public goods, like norms, and the stewardship function, which should be the fundamental functions of the WHO.
Let's turn this open. Are there some questions here in the audience or online? Yes, right here.
Good morning. My name is Lily Muldoon. I'm a MPH candidate here in the Global Health and Populations Department, and thank you for engaging us in this robust conversation. And my question relates to post-2015, which is quickly approaching, and I'm sure we're going to do a critical analysis of our successes with the MDGs and also analysis of, unfortunately, the ones we haven't achieved. And looking beyond that, there's been many proposals about what to prioritize next. For example, out of the Rio Summit in 2012, they suggest the Sustainable Development Goals, promoting more of addressing climate change and having health be critically linked to those types of policies. And then we also have proposals such as Gordon Brown suggests to think more about inequality or the diagonal health infrastructures. So my question is, how should you and how should we as global health leaders reconcile these different frameworks and different proposals going forward?
Mark, why do you want to take that?
Muldoon sounds like a Scottish name. Maybe Gordon should take it.
Yes. Okay.
I don't want to put him on the spot. I can start. Go ahead, Gordon.
Every name is originally Scottish. I think this is a central question that is going to be addressed, of course, over the next year as we complete this work on the post-2015 goals. The first thing I would say is let us not lose sight of the fact that we haven't met many of the existing goals, and that we must not allow the debate about the future to divert attention from the necessity of moving quickly to meet the goals that we set in the past. And that's true in health. It's also true, as you would expect me to say, in education. The second thing is it is right to bring together the environmental objectives with the income, health, education and welfare objectives. And we must find a set of goals that are achievable and can be expressed in ways that people can understand. And we must find a way that, although it was mentioned at the beginning that national governments had responded to the Millennium Development Goals, many of them feel under no obligation to deliver them and are certainly under no constitutional or political direct responsibility to deliver them. So let us find a way, when we finish this work, of trying to bind in those governments that have got a responsibility, because they have some of the greatest problems to taking action most quickly. So one of the failures of the MDGs was in the ability to tie the particular governments where the problems were greatest to the delivery of these objectives in any meaningful way. The third thing I would say is that quality must be important to the next set of goals. We had crude targets in a sense, and that was inevitable. But in education, you don't want just everybody to be at school. You want people to be getting a quality education. In healthcare, you don't want everybody just to be able to be treated. You want them to have quality healthcare, as well as having good doctors and everything else. So I think the debate over the next year has got to focus, one, on making sure we meet the existing goals. Secondly, incorporating these other objectives, but in a meaningful way, where you can express it in policy objectives that can be achieved and are not too abstract. And of course, as I said before, we want to find a way to tie governments in. And I would just repeat, and I know I'm repeating myself from what I said earlier, there must be a way of ensuring that as we raise the ceiling, we do complete that floor by dealing with that group of people that concern me most, who have been left out completely when we have failed to reach some of our targets, and may continue to fail unless they become a greater priority than they are now.
If I could just add to that, one of Gordon's points was we need something that policymakers and people can rally around. And with the availability of social networking and what's necessary to push governments to take responsibility, because this is about people. And I was talking with Richard Curtis, who started Comic Relief in the UK. Some of you may know he's a famous director. He said the only term worse than Millennium Development Goals is Sustainable Development Goals. I mean, what does that mean? At least Millennium had the word millennium in it, and it sounded exciting. So we should come up with something that makes a little more sense than wonky things that we might all talk about in academia or in policy circles. But if you're trying to get people excited about it, Sustainable Development Goals is probably not going to do it. Which is, kind of tongue-in-cheek, but not really, because we have to think about how we move the world towards something, towards a new vision, and you're not going to do it with wonky slogans like that. But there's not competition between the different vantage points. They're all getting at the same thing, which is how do we have a more prosperous, healthier, educated world that works together in a different way. Climate is part of that, but certainly everything else, the current Millennium Development Goals are part of that. I think Gordon's point and what we're trying to say is, how do you put all that together in a way that allows countries and the people in countries and the world to move us in a new direction that's not confined to individual approaches, but we can't lose sight of the things that need to be done in order to achieve those objectives. So it's an exciting moment that will lead to dramatic change if we allow it to, and we don't get bogged down into how is this different than that and what's the priority over this, but how do we create a better world, and what are if that's our goal, what are the structures that need to be in place to allow us to move in that direction?
Another question. Oh, you have a question here.
Yes, we have a lot of questions coming in online, so I just want to share some of them. How do you see the incorporation of evidence-based research in policy making? Would you say there is a need for more networking between networks, which include policymakers, to bridge the science-policy interface? And any ideas on how this can be improved?
I would just say that first function of making sure we produce the knowledge-related global public goods includes that translation so that knowledge informs policy. But that's exactly where we need to invest, not just in producing the programs, but actually evaluating and building a body of evidence of what works and what doesn't work, and what might be adequately transferred across borders. This is, we know that knowledge was a big driver of health improvement since the Second World War. How do we maintain that? But that's exactly one of the functions that I see being perilously neglected in the discussions about priorities moving forward.
Good. Another question. Yes.
Thank you. Thank you very much for speaking with us all. My name is Bill Bean. I'm in Global Health. Bean is originally a Scottish name, sir. So it's changed over the years. What I'd like to know is to take this down from a very, 30,000 foot level, global players, lots and lots of money, and speaking to students directly. What do students need to do today at institutions like the School of Public Health here, other institutions around the world, in order to move the agenda forward? Because I think that's critical. I think that's what we're grappling with. The MDGs, I think, have been enormously successful. People are wondering, so what's next, as my other Scottish colleague, Lily, suggested. But what should students be doing? What career advice would you have for them? And I'm sure Dean Frank has some opinions on this as well. But I'd like to just ask you, on behalf of the students, what you think they should be doing.
They hear from me all the time, so I'm keen to hear from our
Gordon, do
guests.
you have an idea for the
I would
students?
say don't underestimate your power to help make change possible. I was involved in the last year in a campaign that was built around the attempted assassination of Malala Yousafzai in Pakistan. And she had been her life had been subject to an attempted assassination because she was trying to get girls to go to school. As a result of what happened, we managed to get 4 million people worldwide to sign a petition, which was presented to the Pakistan government of the United Nations. Pakistan then agreed that they would introduce for the first time a commitment to universal education, 3 million scholarships, double expenditure on education. Of course, we've got to make sure that that happens, and it's an issue about implementation as well as principle. But don't underestimate the extent to which a few people can make a difference. And when I talk to companies in, say, Africa, if 100 people campaign by texting them to complain about practices of child labour, they get worried. And you may think that the things that you do when you become aware of something that's wrong may not make a huge amount of difference. But don't underestimate the power to both persuade companies and governments and international organizations that if you can come together using the social media and the social networks, you can do something quite big. One example I just give you is child marriage-free zones make a huge difference to health, make a huge difference to education. Pioneered in Bangladesh, young girls coming together in schools to say that they will not allow them and their fellow school children to be married off against their will. Becoming successful in Bangladesh, but an example of how we learn from each other. Malawi now wants to encourage them. Ethiopia now wants to encourage them. And we should be helping some of these innovative advances where young people are getting together to try to ensure that their rights to health and their rights to education are properly protected. So as students and as postgraduates, I think your awareness of things that are wrong can help you actually make a huge difference in the immediate issues that confront us, as well as taking the long-term view, which is equally important.
If I could just add to that, don't feel bound by the way you're educated. So the silos that exist in global health and development exist in every academic institution. So you get trained and taught in this discipline, and you don't see the other disciplines or think about the other disciplines. You're not taught to, you're thinking about them. And don't feel bound by that. Do what is necessary, which is reach across, learn multiple issues, learn about development, and how the things fit together. I was talking with one of your colleagues, Corey, a student here, and he said that what he wants to do is not focus on one disease, but a whole bunch of things and how you make a community better. That's where we should be thinking, where you should be thinking. Julio's thinking of a way to structure education in that new way, but our education system is built in the same siloed way that our goals are. Not surprisingly, that's how they got created. The people who are educated that way came forward with that as the solution. So break all those molds open and create a world that's different based on a new vision.
Well, I can see we're going to change education at the Harvard School of Public Health. But I want to just pick up before we leave. We've had all these great ideas, but I don't want us to just stop and have another conference in a year and nothing is done. What has to happen after we end to, in a sense, get this global vision going? Let me start with you, Gordon.
Well, It's great to be part of a university seminar, by the way, because I was brought up to believe, as a university lecturer in my first life, that universities stand for integrity and objectivity and impartiality and rationality. And then I found that these were all the qualities I had to leave behind when I went into politics. I think the best thing that could come out of this very important seminar, and I do applaud the organisers as well as the audience, is that we give some strength to the idea that Julio and Mark are putting forward, are Bretton Woods for health. How that can be created requires governments to do things, but the pressure to create it can come from people who are concerned that we're not making the best use of resources. So in addition to this year's work, which must include focusing on the Millennium Development Goals as they develop, I think we should give real consideration to how we can bring people together. I would say you start with a conference where you bring together all the potential leaders in this field, including the private sector and foundations, and then you debate whether the coordination of the health policy network globally can be better achieved by institutional reform. And whether Harvard does that, or whether Mark does that at the Global Fund, or whether there are other ways we can do that, I think it is really an idea whose time has come, and I am delighted, therefore, to be part of a seminar that involves the two authors of the proposal.
Mark, Julio, any?
I'll leave the last word to Mark. I would just completely agree with what Gordon Brown has said. And I do think we're at a critical juncture. We are about to reach the deadline of the 2015. There's a very energized discussion about the future. And I think if we stop for a minute and think, first of all, about people, and we focus the discussion around people, people are, especially those people that are left behind systematically, people are women and children and girls, and we take into account their entire set of needs and develop goals with that perspective, thinking about individuals and populations and the communities of which they are part, rather than the siloed approach. And then we build a new governance set of mechanisms to make sure that we truly understand that we are in a world of interdependence. We've moved from dependence, that was, the old traditional colonial ways that Mark talked about. We moved into independence, that was the technical cooperation mantra of the last century. We need to embrace interdependence, and interdependence means to assume that we are part of a global society with mutual responsibilities for each other and mutual obligations as part of this interdependent world. And that requires, to me, to focus beyond the silos and on people.
And Mark, we're leaving this to you to inspire us for the next phase.
I don't want to do anything more than agree with what Gordon and Julio said. The worst thing, we used to joke that if the outcome of a meeting is another meeting or a conference, you failed miserably. But Gordon's right. We have to bring people together to sit down, just like what happened after World War II around Bretton Woods when the world was falling apart, and seeing that we couldn't get to where we needed to go with what we had. We're at that point. We are not going to get where we need to go with the way we're currently structured and the way we're doing things, the current way we're thinking about things. So you don't get over that by just accidentally hoping it happens. You actually have to push for it, which means the thinking behind it, the writing of it, the putting it together, and the pressure on people to get together, sit down and say, this isn't working. And this is what we need to do to fix it. And it's going to happen if you all want it to happen. I mean, you're the generation that's going to make this happen. Put the pressure on the people who are making the decisions now to get it done. It really is no longer a question of can we do it. The question is, will we do it? And it's not going to happen if people don't get up and say, we need to do it.
I would say, must we do it? We must. Thank you so much. We are at the end of the forum. You can continue the conversation online. And I invite you to come to the forum on December 4th, which will be about healthcare. And I appreciate that you're all here and joining the revolution to make global health a vision for the future. Thank you.